Ostap Kryvdyk is a Royal College of Defence Studies member. He's got an MA from King's College London and is the chair of the Ukrainian Strategic Initiative think tank of the Kyiv Mohyla Academy, Ukraine. And that is where he is joining us from today. Before we jump into this episode, a huge thank you to everyone who is supporting our campaign to crowdsource vehicles to send over to Ukraine. We will potentially be driving them over again like we did in January. I'm hugely appreciative to everyone who's supported that. These are essential pieces of equipment to help keep Ukrainian forces resilient. Please check out the description in the video. Also, thank you to everyone who has bought me a coffee or become a patron. It's incredibly important to help keep the work of the channel going, especially as the Middle East is once again sucking up everybody's attention, and we really should not forget about Ukraine, which I still believe is the #1 geopolitical issue in the world. Ostap, welcome to the channel.
Hello, Jonathan. Thank you for having me, and thank you for your gentle support to the Ukrainian armed forces with vehicles. It's really essential, and the fight which goes on at the front line is based on those trucks, and this is really vital. Thank you.
It's incredibly important. When we saw ourselves in Lviv, where these trucks are converted to be sort of, ready for the front, and steel plates are placed in them. And we've also seen photos of several of the trucks we crowdsourced have now been destroyed, as their lifespan is not necessarily that long at the front. And all the crews not only survived, but with minimal injuries. So, we've seen directly the incredible importance of these vehicles. Well, let's jump into the discussion. I'm going to post this link into the description of the video because you've written what I think is an absolutely fascinating article, which is titled "The Dangers of Chicken Kyiv Thinking." Now, people may be aware of that in 1991. Prior to the sort of Budapest Memorandum, but this was Bush's speech where he basically tried to persuade Ukraine not to secede from the USSR, not to break out from under, the let's say benign shelter, ironic, of Russian imperialism, and then only a few weeks later the USSR collapsed. And that is probably one of the most misguided speeches in history. But your argument is that Kyiv thinking did not die in that moment, and we did not learn the lesson from it.
Yes, I still do believe many of the world's policymakers, foreign policy experts, and moreover, general audience still think in a way that first and foremost, Russia is eternal. Russia was there, Russia is, and Russia will be forever. Second, due to this thinking, Russia has the right to its own sphere of interest and having its subjects, because it's a grand power, and so it should be. It's like a law of nature. Like the rain is falling, like the wind is blowing, Russia is having its subjects. But this reality is maintained both because of violence of Russia, but also because of the appeasement of those who believe this is the right thing to have. And here in this article, I mostly paid attention to the people who are now being subjugated in modern Russian empire, which is named Russian Federation, which is a bizarre name for something that is not a federation, first and foremost. And empires do collapse. Russian Empire actually collapsed twice in the 20th century and was at the brink of the collapse for the third time during the Second World War. And in all those three situations, Russia was saved by the West to keep its subjects, to continue the genocidal policies, and, interestingly, to further threaten the West. After the First World War, the Bolshevik Revolution created a war state of the kind of North Korea, which threatened the West with the World Revolution. And it was only transactional relationship between the US, the UK, and the Soviet Union to defeat the Nazi Germany, which, because those two industrial powers and those two allies saved Soviet Union from total collapse, then turned into Cold War. Then the whole West was threatened with a nuclear extermination. And it stayed so up until Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And Russian Empire was saved again, saved as a nuclear power, saved as a savage empire which started genocidal wars again. If we see Ichkeria, this was and remains a genocidal war. And Russia kept on repeating and repeating things in Transnistria, in Karabakh, in many places around its own sphere, creating that belt of instability in order to restore the empire. And what we are witnessing is the next iteration of Russian Empire trying to reset itself with the human and industrial potential of Ukraine. Ukraine is a missing link in the Russian Empire. Contemporary Russia has lost its capabilities on shipbuilding, on missile building, on plane building, and if God forbid, Russia reclaims Ukraine back, those capabilities will be put back as a part of the puzzle. And Russian phrase "можем повторить," we can do it again, does not refer only to Ukraine. Russians were in Berlin, Russians were in Paris, Russians have not yet been to London, but I don't think they consider it as something beyond their imagination. So
Their oligarchs have been in London, so in some sense, they may feel an entitlement.
oh yes, Lord Lebedev, I think, enjoys his position, and this is something I cannot understand, because from the point of view of the immune system of Britain, people like him shouldn't be allowed to remain in the UK to enjoy the freedoms of your country and, of course, to own media. Those are agents, a minimum of agents of influence, but actually those are active agents. You look into his heritage and you clearly see that this is KGB. This is something that you don't erase from your biography. It's just a function.
And we have another modern generation of so-called Russian political intelligentsia in the form of opposition. And again, when you look at some of their words, including Koromorza, which we were talking about before we hit record, it seems that they are as concerned about Russia disintegrating as the regime itself is. Yes, they want to take over the system, they want to take over the vertical of power, and relabel it as a liberal vertical of power.
Oh yes,
But
liberal empire.
what they share with the regime is desire, I believe, and this is implicit, I think, in many of their words, to keep the ethnic Russian dominance of the republics. The last thing they want is the disintegration. Now, Khodorkovsky talks about loose federalization. Only Kasparov openly, I think, talks about decolonization. And there are a few academics like Alexander Etkind and a few others who go there and they talk about, real decolonization and the actual process of colonizing, Russian territories, which is extremely brutal from the sort of 16th, 17th century through to the 20th century. But the
It was
majority, I think,
genocide after genocide.
genocide of genocide. And the only reason we don't know about it is one, intellectual laziness, and the other one is they destroy the evidence. In Ukraine, they didn't destroy the evidence. And that's maybe, do you feel, is that one of the reasons why Ukraine is able to resist?
Speaking of Russian opposition, we need to distinguish the real opposition who is fighting with weapons against the Russians, as against the Imperial Russians on the front line, and those who immigrated into the countries of the free world and is imitating some democratic process within the diaspora, which resembles me to an extent the white Russian diaspora, which has actually never returned back to Russia. There is a deep disengagement between the Russian opposition and the general Russian population, which unfortunately is as imperial as current Russian regime is.
And there's
Yes,
no
there.
connection between modern diaspora really and that. I mean, many of them have died out, but their descendants around. It seems to me there's very little connection between the different generations of emigration. That's not the case for Ukrainian generations. There seems to be far more connection in various countries, especially Canada.
Well, Russian war against Ukraine actually united Ukrainian diaspora, which was also, there were gaps, say, new diaspora coming, didn't speak the language of the country, wasn't integrated, and was economically on a different standing. But right now, full-scale aggression, especially full-scale aggression, broke any of the walls that there might have been between the old and the new diaspora. And considering the vastness of the new diaspora that unfortunately came from Ukraine, millions of new people, many of the old Ukrainian institutions got reborn. There were situations in the UK, for instance, when the old communities were already dying out. And they were selling their properties. Right now, when a lot of Ukrainians came as refugees, those institutions, those schools, those churches got new life and they are full of people. They are very active. They're collecting donations. They're bringing uh, uh, nets to mask the positions. They are bringing helmets. They are bringing many things to the front line. Especially valuable are those first aid kits, for instance. But there is this connection in between the Ukrainian diaspora, but also the diaspora and Ukraine. And that connection has never been really stronger. With all diaspora people actually traveling here, although it's sometimes dangerous, but many of them also try to visit the frontline, the units to which they donate. So it really reconnected us. Contrary to this, war has disconnected Russian diaspora and Russia. Still, imperial feelings in the Russian diaspora persist. If you look into the celebration of the so-called Day of Victory in the Russian diaspora, which doesn't have the connotation of remembering of the most tragic war in the history of mankind, which killed tens of millions, and the biggest amount of killed actually were people living on the territory occupied by the Soviet Union. It turns into the celebration of war.
Yeah.
And this is remarkable. And this is also something I believe the Western governments should pay attention to. I think Germans now lead in condemnation of this celebration of war. But the next steps should be done. This is not something historical. Russians, when they celebrate the war, they don't celebrate history. They celebrate the present. They celebrate today's genocide. And there should be responsibility for that. We know that, as Bible says, the word was there at the beginning. And when there is a celebration of war in London, the war will come to London. And those who celebrate it there should bear responsibility. First and foremost, moral responsibility, but then we need to ask the question, if you support Russian genocidal activities in Ukraine, do you have the right to live in a free country which respects rule of law, which respects human dignity? And this is a tough and tricky question because especially when those people went through the procedure of gaining citizenship, uh, this is also a question of national security of democracies, including Great Britain. How, say, torturing animals is a crime in civilized societies, but endorsing tortures of humans still remains kind of okay. It's within the freedom of public expression, isn't it? So there's a paradox, and I do understand I somewhat overstep, but this issue needs to be raised. People need to bear responsibility for what they say. In a way,
especially as
I bear a
repetition.
responsibility for
Mhm.
my words. Say, if Russians monitor what I'm saying, I think this will cost me life if I get into their hands. Is there any responsibility for those who support such Russia's behavior towards people like myself, towards the Ukrainians who dare to stand against Russian oppression? This is the question.
Exactly right. And they have a long memory. Everything that is said, everything that's written at some point,
And
it represents a
Jonathan,
risk. Mhm.
sorry to say, but we also need to have long memory. It's essential that we have long memory, and that's what Russians are very good at. They are playing with the memory of the others. They are trying to annul things. And I'm afraid they succeed with this. In some of the moments, one of the most evident ways Russians are trying to annul memory, it's their way of pretending to be the moderators in the conflicts where they are actually the perpetrators, the aggressors. This is one of the very classical ways of them behaving, and this needs to be stopped and this needs to be named. I am afraid the last G7 meeting failed to do that.
Let's turn to Western policy then, because throughout this war, and Biden has verbally, rhetorically, I think, been allowed to get away with a lot of stuff. Um, and it's taken quite a bit of thinking to actually get behind what's really going on. And I'd be interested to hear if you agree. What seems to be going on, and this is not just Washington, this seems to be Berlin and other capitals as well. Ukraine is supported insofar as its survival is thought to be important, not as important as other things, but important. Um, but the primacy seems to be given to the idea of stability and stasis, and Russia not being allowed to collapse, despite its own fervent efforts to do everything possible to destroy itself through a senseless war. We seem to be minded to help preserve, as you say, this Russian imperial entity. Is that your thinking as well? And why on earth do we convince ourselves that this is a good strategy?
I am afraid that at the core of this strategy is cowardice. West does not want war. If we look into it from the point of view of pure moralism, well, it's a fair point. Wars are brutal, wars kill people, wars devastate lands, on which they are fought wars are bad. But what if war is coming for you and you decline to fight it? You decline to defend your women, your children, your elderly, your memory, your identity, your dignity. What about it? Is then the war to defend those things as evil as the imperial war? And I'm afraid there is a lack of cohesive moral answer to it, which should be there are the wars which are right. It is okay to defend. Now, having said that, I will say another thing. Wars are not won in defense. We need to respond to enemies' attacks, not in a symmetrical way and not only in a defensive way. We need to strike the enemy where it hurts. And we've seen the spider's web operation striking Russian forces deeply in Russia. I still see it as defensive because Russia is allowed deep strikes. For some bizarre reason, Ukraine has been denied the opportunity for deep strikes in Russia. This is a immoral situation when a victim is denied the right to defend itself. This is wrong. But a side of moral side of it, which I believe is essential because morality is practical. The value of justice, the value of good and bad is practical. It's not a theoretical discussion. And the Western societies are the richest societies in the world because the morale is put in the core of justice, of the life of those societies. And the bad is punished and the good is protected. That's why you are so successful. And those who call moral arguments irrelevant and turn into the so-called realism are not realistic, because it is realistic to be moral. It is cynical to be to change the morality for the so-called realism. And I am afraid the whole story not to let Ukraine lose, not to let Russia win, turned out to let Ukraine lose and to let Russia win. At the moment, Ukraine is not losing. I would consider it as a controlled retreat. Yes, we are losing land, but we are not losing war. But is it a sustainable situation? Should we spend another 10 years losing a village every day? This is wrong. At least Ukraine is to be provided the opportunity to kill enemies' logistics near the front line, which says the range of 100 kilometers, but without depriving Russia of its industrial capability in Alabuga and in other parts which are 2,000-3,000 kilometers from Ukraine. We do not win this war. Let me put it even higher. What's the theory of victory? And what's the theory of defeat of Russia? And I am afraid there is no discussion on the matter in the top circles, because if we do not have strategic clarity, we do not have policy on the matter. If we do not have policy, there's a saying, if you do know where you go, you will definitely end up in the wrong place. And we do not know where we go. We, the Ukrainians, are shaping our vision of victory, which is restoring our borders and, yes, defeating the empire. Now, what does defeating the empire mean? What is the situation we should put Russia in so it considers itself being defeated? Russia is a global issue. Ukraine is not a global power to tackle the global issue. This is an irrelevant task to the entity which is Ukraine. Yes, Ukraine can be a regional player, but we cannot reshape Asia. This is misappropriated, and there's a lack of the responsibility of global powers. The United States of America and Europe as an entity, and Europe can be a global power. I don't believe Germany can be a global power. I don't believe France can be a global power. But altogether, Germany and France and Great Britain and Italy and Netherlands and Nordics can be a global power. And that's what we really need. Destiny of Ukraine will define destiny of Russia. Destiny of Russia will define the destiny of the world. This is the task we really need to accomplish together. Or if we fail, a small peninsula of Asia, which Europe is, will be defeated and will be downgraded. There's quite a few spaces with the same area as Europe is, which play minimal role in the destiny of the world. And this is the challenge we are facing. And this is not an imperial challenge. This is not the challenge for Europe to conquer Russia. This is a challenge for Europe to disassemble a hostile entity. And it's a high time for Europe to understand that the collapse of Russian empire, in a way, Spanish empire collapsed in Latin America, is in Europe's best interest. Then dozens of new states emerging on the territory of collapsed Russian empire might become viable partners. Then it's time for business. Then it'll be even time for spiritual things. And I will speak here as a devout Catholic. I believe Russian Catholic Church is on the verge of a moral collapse. Church is a moral institution, first and foremost, and Russian Church endorsing imperial genocidal war means that its theology is going to become irrelevant. And there will be a window to re-Christianize post-Russian territories. It's a fascinating challenge for those who feel a call for spiritual service in Catholic Church, in evangelic churches. The barbarism of today's Russia is enormous. Those who really look into deep Russia and see how brutal life there is in this total alcoholism, in this total endorsement of prison culture, there's a huge civilizational gap between the societies of the West and of Russia, and the barbarism which Russian troops committed on Ukraine's territory, Bucha, is very relevant to the barbarism of the contemporary Russian life. And if we want to cure this barbarism, if we do not want Bucha to be repeated in Warsaw, in Prague, in Berlin, in Paris, and in London, we need to see Russia as a moral problem as well. We need to reset those territories in moral matter. We need to, and it's a generational problem, how to engage the future generation of people who live in today's Russia and how to make them rid of the imperial thinking, of which genocidal activities is an essential part. What is genocide like? It is to conquer people. It is to exterminate part of that population which is different. And it is to force the rest of them to become Russians. So they become the next wave of soldiers to go and to commit genocide. Right now, people from Zaporizhia region, which 3.5 years ago used to be Ukraine, constitutionally and legally and in all the matters, and which remains Ukraine in international law still. So people there are forced into the Russian reality and they go to the front line. And people from Melitopol now are sent in mid waves to kill Ukrainians. This is exactly the scenario Russia is readying for Europe. If they conquer Warsaw, they send Poles to kill Germans. If they conquer Germany, they will send Germans to conquer Netherlands, and then they will send them to conquer Great Britain. This sounds totally paranoid, and I fully recognize the paranoia of those words. But had I had said that people from Zaporizhia region would be sent to kill Ukrainians, and that was as far as 4 years ago, and this would have sounded as paranoid as the words I'm saying to you now. We are living in a mad reality, and we need to prevent it from spreading.
And Chechens as well, you know.
Yes,
They've
turning
this has
them
been
from the
done. Yeah.
rebels into the avant-garde of the genocidal policies. This is exactly the scenario Russia is implementing.
I know we're
And
out of time. I think we're almost out of time. I don't know if we can squeeze one last one in. The West may not be able to grasp the idea of victory or defeat. That may be too far for their imagination at this point. But at least the idea of containment should be sensible. But it seems there's no plan even for the containment of Russia. Is that because the genocidal character of Russian imperialism is simply not understood?
I think one of the major problems here is a gap in values and in thinking between the West and Russia. One of the excellent lectures at the RCDS was about the values. For many of my group mates, this was a very abstract lecture. I remember the sole phrase from it. When your interests are becoming more important than your values, your interests are becoming your values. And this is a sad truth that is true about the West. The value of energy, the value of not being engaged in a war as an interest becomes more important than the value of true security and the value of dignity and the value of sustained peace. That's why Russian shadow fleet still carries the oil, and the impunity or that gradual creeping under delivering sanctions is still in place. And it's been more than 3 years. And Russia still makes money for its genocidal war. So, but again, you make a very fair point that because of this, West neglects its own security. Because Russia, as a potent force, being able to wage war against the wider West and specifically against Europe, is a direct threat to your national security. And Russia becoming mastered on the long range assaults on Ukraine it's a direct threat to you, to bombing of your cities, to the repeat of the blitz in a way we the Ukrainians are experiencing right now. I apologize for the unpleasant words I am saying right now, but I see Ukraine as a further testing ground. And the news of today's Odessa burning might be the news of tomorrow's Birmingham and Manchester. And I'm sorry to say this. And I don't want this to happen to the Great Britain.
I
I want
encourage
this to
people
be
to
prevented.
I encourage people to actually go and see with their own eyes. I was in Odessa just a few weeks ago, and to see the images of the city today is not just heartbreaking, but infuriating as well. And I'll go further than you. If we do not keep Russian central bank assets frozen, if we do not utilize those to contain and defeat Russia in Ukraine, then we are quite literally slitting our own throats.
Well, do we have time for people and for the elites to understand the reality, to accept it, and to act on it? Because being paralyzed by the war which is coming is not a good response. Uh, those who live in parts of the world who are facing the storms, who are facing the earthquakes like Japan, they do something, they change the architecture of their homes. And we also should act if the storm is coming.
Ostap, I look forward to continuing this conversation and diving into some of these issues in different directions and more detail. For today, though, thank you so much for your impassioned, clear, and direct explanation of what is going on. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you.